And good afternoon. Welcome to Searching for the Truth on a beautiful Friday afternoon somewhere. We're under a flash flood warning, actually, right here in Saline County. It is pouring down rain outside, and it's cold and nasty. If you're out and about in central Arkansas, be very careful. I noticed several water puddles that earlier today that had passed over the road, and it just kept on raining. So be careful if you're out there. Good to have everyone with us this afternoon. Appreciate it very, very much. As always, if you have a question or comment, we would love to hear from you. Our phone number is 1-855-568-1062, 1-855-568-1062, or you can comment right here under the video. Happy Friday to you too, Debbie. Appreciate very much you being with us. Also, like and share and get the word out. Let folks know that we're on the air. And I need to do that a little bit too. I did it a little, but not as much as I certainly needed to. Just get the word out a little bit. It is always good to share. Well, that doesn't give me the opportunity to share. Well, that's because I'm clicking on the wrong one here. Let's try this one. Yep, there we go. Different link. Anyhow, we're going to be talking about the problem of evil today. It was requested last Wednesday afternoon, and so that's what we are going to be discussing. Why does evil exist? If God is so kind, merciful, loving, caring, and powerful, how in the world could he allow evil to exist in his creation? So that's what we're going to be talking about this afternoon. And if you have any questions or comments, go ahead and just post underneath the video, and or give us a call again, 1-855-568-1062, and throw that up on the screen again. If God is all powerful, all good, and all loving, then why is there evil? Why does God allow good people, and I put that in quotes, from an earthly, worldly perspective? Why does God allow good people to suffer? Why does God allow Christians to suffer? Those who are godly and faithful to Him. Hopefully we'll be able to give some biblical answers to that question. Now, certainly there are some things that we're not going to be able to answer in every detail. Okay, I can't tell you why every circumstance is allowed to take place as it does. I can simply tell you what the Bible has to say about it. About God being the source of good, and all evil is the result of Satan's work, and of course man's surrendering to Satan and sin itself. And so, all right, that's where we're going this afternoon. James, how are you?
Well, I'm doing very well. I'm glad to be here.
I'm glad to have you as well, and let's get started here this afternoon. First of all, we're living in an age of tragedy. I mean, of course, I guess every generation can say that to some extent, right? But it does seem like there have been a lot more recently, whether it be school shootings, terrible accidents. Right, there was a plane crash right here in Little Rock yesterday. Sickness. Well, how can God allow young, innocent children to suffer so? This is a problem that has plagued both believers and unbelievers alike. You know, in fact, it is something that unbelievers throw up as a reason why they do not believe in God. You know, the unbelieving critic will say, well, why would a God who is all good and all loving and all knowing and all powerful allow bad things to happen to good people? If he's all loving, then doesn't he care? And if he's all powerful, doesn't he have the ability to stop it? And if he's all loving and all powerful, then if he exists, then he should stop it. Well, why doesn't he?
Well, that's the presupposition that actually is a fallacy, which is that he should.
Huh?
It really has to do with God is love, and therefore he does not force himself upon anybody, and he allows us to exercise free will,
Yeah.
and there are consequences to that free will, and even storms like we have today. That's part of the weather pattern as a consequence of the flood in Noah's day, when the whole world was corrupted. All flesh had been corrupted at that point, according to Genesis 6. And so there are indirect consequences on us even today with tornadoes and hurricanes and such like.
So, even believers, would say something sometimes in a moment of tragedy, in a moment of heartache, how could God let this happen to me and to my family? How could this happen? Why would God not stop this pain and help me? Where's God in the midst of all of this? And it's not because they don't believe in God. They're wondering where God is because they're in pain.
Well, in the case of Job, first of all, he was put into emotional pain by Satan taking everything away from him. And notice it was Satan that took him away.
Right. It was Satan.
Even his children. And Job's wife suffered as well, as far as losing everything and the children. The only thing that Satan did not take away from Job was his wife, and that's so he could use her to try to get him to curse God and die.
But God did allow
Yes,
it.
he did. He did
Now,
allow it.
God allowed it. God allows evil to take place. I want to tell you there's going to come a day in which God will no longer allow evil to take place.
Right.
His judgment is coming. Every wrong is going to be justly dealt with.
Yep.
And every human being is going to have to stand before God and give an account for how they live their life, the choices that they've made, the harm that they've caused to others, the sins that they themselves have committed. All these things are going to be dealt with by God. But right now we're living in a time in which free will exists, sin exists, therefore pain and suffering exists.
Well, even when Adam and Eve sinned, he cursed the ground so it would be harder for man to get food from the ground. He had to work to start with, but he did it, and Romans 8 explains the same thing. He subjected creation to futility, but he did it in hope. In other words,
and Romans chapter 8 does talk about that.
Yeah, and Romans 5 talks about that process, that tribulation produces perseverance, perseverance produces character, character produces hope. So
that's right.
The only way that we are going to develop with character is if we go through these very difficult things.
Right. Matthew 5 and verse 45. Jesus says that you may be sons of your Father in heaven, for he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the just and on the unjust. You know what? He does good for everybody. He provides good things for everybody. Are we grateful for those good things? Now, again, every bad thing happens because of sin. God is no respecter of persons in that he provides good for everybody. Just like, let me get really to the bottom matter here, the crux of the matter. God even gave his son Jesus Christ for everybody. Now, as we go through the study today, we may make a few references to Calvinistic theology because, listen, if the God of Calvinism were indeed the true God, I can understand why an atheist would not want to believe in him, because the Calvinistic system makes God the root cause. He is the first cause of all that is evil. Everything bad that has ever happened in the history of mankind happened because God decreed it, God determined it, and it can be no other way. God is the first cause of that evil, according to Calvinistic theology. And I want to say to you right now, my friend, that is not what the Bible presents.
No. And as a matter of fact, couldn't you say that their doctrine of sovereignty would actually have God being the author of every act of evil, not
Yes.
just being the first cause generically.
Yes, he is the author of every act of evil.
Yeah, that's how much they think that God micromanages
Every
everything.
murder, every rape, every horrendous act in human history, whether it be Adolf Hitler or whoever. God is the one who predetermined that, decreed that, and brought that to pass. So, okay, with that out of the way, it is a reality that bad things happen. Good, godly people suffer. You go back to the very beginning. Of course, Adam and Eve being kicked out of the Garden of Eden, they had to start suffering as soon as they exited. As you mentioned, they're going to have to start working, sweating. They're going to have difficulty in eating. Everything is going to be harder because of their sin.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what about then even in Genesis chapter 4? You've got a righteous man, Abel, who offers a sacrifice that God accepted. His brother Cain offered a sacrifice that God did not accept. Cain becomes angry. He's angry with God. He's angry with his brother Abel. He rises up and kills his brother. And of course, God deals with Cain in that event. Where's your brother? Am I your brother's keeper? Am I my brother's keeper? Cain said. In fact, it's interesting what God said to Cain. If you do good, before he killed his brother, if you do good, you'll be accepted. Mm-hmm. But sin lies at the door, and you ought to reign over it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, you ought to resist it.
Right.
That indicates free will in Cain right there.
Yeah, and of course, the claim of the Calvinists is that man lost that ability to choose to do good after Adam and Eve sinned, but clearly God is appealing to Cain to do what's right.
You've got a choice here, Cain.
He could still be accepted if he did well after he had made the wrong sacrifice to start with that displeased God.
We've already mentioned Job. You think of Job. Job was a godly man. In fact, God, Satan presents himself before God. God makes the point, have you considered my servant Job? He's a righteous man. God accepted Job. And of course, Job says, or Satan says, if you allow me to touch him, you put a fence around him, a hedge around him, and, everything is well in his life. If you allow me to curse him, he will curse you to your face. So I will suggest to you that in and of itself gives us a hint as to the reason why God allows suffering to take place.
Yeah.
The righteous are proved even in the midst of suffering. The trust in God, the faithfulness to God is going to become evident in the midst of suffering. And, Satan thought that Job would curse God and die. But of course, Job was godly. He trusted the Lord. And he continued to trust the Lord. Naked I came into this world. Naked I'll go out. Praise be the Lord.
Blessed be the name of the Lord.
So, that was Job's attitude. In fact, James chapter 5 and verse 11. Have you remember Job? Think about Job. Look what God allowed Job to go through, but yet look at Job's faith as a result of it. And that, by the way, also is a testimony to us. If Job could be faithful through all of this, can't you be? Shouldn't you be?
Yeah, and he also mentioned the prophets as an example of perseverance, and that's pretty much the theme of 1 Peter, that you suffer for righteousness' sake, you glorify God. We see Jesus enduring everything he endured. He glorified God by the things that he suffered, as well as his resurrection and exaltation. After death, he had to go through death in order for God, in order to be glorified as the Son of Man.
I'm seeing the comments coming in and got some good ones so far. We've got 1 Peter 1, 6, which is the passage we'll be looking at a little later. Also, so that the proof of your faith being more precious than gold. Yeah. First Peter chapter 1 does talk about that. Our faith is tested. So their faith can be stronger and trust in Him. Revelation 2 and verse 10.
And that kind of goes along with Hebrews chapter 12, which is what we're studying in our Bible class on Sunday mornings. As children of God, we're loved by the Lord, and He chastens us. And I believe the chastening in that context historically was persecution because they were Christians,
Right.
and they suffered financially as well.
Absolutely. And, you think, as Lori says, because God allows evil does not mean He is the author of it. That's exactly right. Just because
True.
I allow my sons to experience pain, that I'll tell them, don't do that because this is what's going to happen. Or I used to. They're grown and adults, and they're out, doing their own thing now. One's a very faithful child of God. He preaches some, lives in Alabama, or lives in Georgia technically. But when they were little, you know what? I'd tell them, don't do this. And I knew that they were going to do things that were wrong, and I allowed them to do things that were wrong. I didn't say, go do it, but I permitted it by letting them have some freedom. And when they did, here you go. Guess what? And one of the things that I tell you what, as a parent, will get you, it'll touch your heart, is when they come to you and said, Dad, I wish I'd have listened. You told me, But a lot of times we learn lessons the best, when we experience those things.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
experience is the saying is experience is the best teacher, but
the best way to learn is to listen the first time and don't do it. That's the best way.
That's my comeback.
But
Proverbs is written for that reason.
But God does allow us to do these things that He knows will be harmful to us, because He has given us free will.
Yeah.
That's the thing. And no, He's not the author because He allows that.
And it's not fair that I can make some bad decisions and my family suffers.
Right.
And of course it's not fair, but God will right all wrongs.
Yeah, my wife always says, grandkids, well, Nana, that's not fair. Fair is a place you go to ride rides. So, the suffering of Joseph. I mean, think about Joseph. From the very beginning, he is presented as a young man who's faithful to his father. He is the son that the father could trust. That's from the very beginning of the book or the story of the life of Joseph. By the way, I presented a lesson a few weeks ago on Joseph, the first half of his life. In this upcoming Lord's Day morning, I'm going to present another lesson on Joseph, and we'll be looking at his time in prison, and we'll be looking at his exaltation and his reuniting with his family and all of that, and some lessons that we can learn from those events in Joseph's life. But listen, Joseph suffered a lot. For 17 years, he served as a slave. He was, there in prison. Now, God blessed him in that. God was with him, and Joseph believed that. And even though he was forgotten, left in prison, all the things that he suffered, being falsely accused, he was still, protected by God. There was a limit. And Joseph was a man of faith throughout the entire process, and eventually he was exalted, you see. And I think that's a good story that we need to remember. Just because we're going through hard times, doesn't mean that God's not there. What it means is God is saying, be faithful. The exaltation's coming. Remember that. We live in hope.
Yeah, and that was true even of Abraham. His hope was not, eternal life on earth. His hope was a heavenly country. So that requires physical death. Yeah. In the meantime, and as far as the quality of life, how much suffering compared to how much pleasure, we've been spoiled with modern technology and everything else, especially here in America. But even in poorer countries nowadays, there's technology that's so common that we hardly can even relate to the difficulties of life that we read about Abraham and others having. Not to mention Joseph, and how hard he had it, being hated by his brothers and falsely accused when he was a slave and being thrown into the prison there. We need to make sure we're not just taking a snapshot and trying to draw a conclusion about our whole life and what the whole world is about because of what has happened to us personally or what is happening to us personally at the moment. That's a snapshot of an entire life, but you take that into the entire context of eternity. Of Earth history is a blip. Not to mention just my life is a vapor.
That's one of the
Can
things.
Can you measure it?
I always try to impress upon people to have a mindset in which you're viewing this life, your entire life, but especially in this moment, look at it in perspective with eternity. That's what Paul said in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 16. I mean, that's the point. How did he view his suffering in the present time? He viewed it through the lens of eternity, through his everlasting life that God is promising him. And that's how we have to view this thing, this entire subject. So,
and not only did he view it as far as the amount, like, affliction is only temporary, whereas eternity, I'll have the reward forever. But it talks about, the more he suffers, the more is the contrast with the increasingly great reward in contrast with that suffering. So he called it light affliction.
So that's always impressed me. This light affliction, which is but for a moment, is working for us. What? Okay.
Far more and exceeding eternal weight of glory. So there's two contrasts there. There's quantity and quality.
Yeah, you think about the suffering of Paul. I mean, he enumerates some of the things in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, in chapter 12. I mean, he talks about in chapter 12 his thorn in the flesh, but before that in chapter 11, I mean, he goes through a long list of things that he had suffered for the cause of Christ. Well, why did God allow Paul to suffer that way? Well, could you say, well, he deserved all that because, look, he persecuted Christians. Well, there may be a point to be made there. I mean, he did, but you know what? Peter suffered too. I mean, one of the Jameses had their head cut off. I mean, you think about Stephen. I mean, he was stoned to death. He wasn't an apostle, but he was an evangelist. He was one who was working with the apostles. Guess what? He was stoned to death right there at the beginning. And, God allowed that to happen. You think about Paul and all the suffering that he experienced. Think about Jesus, the sinless Son of God.
Yeah, who deserved it the least, of course, because he never sinned.
Never sinned. He did,
and was treated the worst.
He left the glories of heaven and came to this earth for the purpose of suffering. Okay, and that's one of the things when he entered into the world. He entered into a fallen world in which all around him was corruption. He entered into a world where there was pain and there was suffering. And he experienced heartache while he was living on the earth. He experienced all the things that we experience. Hebrews chapter 4, verse 15 makes that very point. So does Hebrews 2 and verse 17.
Yeah, about every temptation he suffered because he didn't give in to it.
That's right. So you think about Jesus and all that he suffered, including his death, of course, the cruel death on the cross. So suffering is a reality because of the world in which we live. But again, this goes back to the point that we were making a few moments ago. An obedient faith in Jesus Christ does not guarantee a good life here on this earth. It's not like what Joel Osteen says. He says, have your best life now. No. Anyone who's having their best life now is in serious trouble.
Yeah, Jesus said, woe to those that seek to save their lives because they will lose it, whereas those that are willing to give up their life, they will have it for eternity.
They'll save it. And so An obedient faith in Christ does not guarantee a perfect life here. In fact, we're not going to have a perfect life here. We're going to have heartaches. We're going to have, if you live in this world long enough, you're going to have heartaches, pain, suffering, trials. But we have the perfect eternity guaranteed if we are faithful.
Yeah, this is kind of what Satan was offering Jesus. I'll give you all the kingdoms of the earth if you just bow down and worship me. But what God promised and what God offers is much greater, and that's what Jesus received. All authority in heaven as well as on earth, because all authority on earth means nothing compared to all authority in heaven. But that really should be a lesson for us, that whatever Satan is offering us in this life, the here and now, it is hardly can even be compared to what God has promised us.
Well, it can't be compared, and that's again Paul's point in 2 Corinthians chapter 4. Romans chapter 8 verses 17 and 18. Think about what Paul said there. How can this present suffering be compared with that eternal weight of glory? You really can't make that comparison. Again, you've got to look at the time in this world. It's just a little speck, a little dot in your existence. So, got to think about it that way. James 1, verses 16 and 17, though, says, "Do not be deceived, my beloved brethren." It had previously been talking, beginning in verse 2. Count your trials as joy. Okay, count it all joy when you fall into various trials. And he doesn't say if, by the way. He says when you fall into various trials.
Well, all those that are righteous will suffer persecution.
2 Timothy 3 and verse 12. So don't be deceived, my beloved brethren. Every good gift and every perfect gift is from above and comes down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow of turning. Where does all good things come from?
It comes from God, from the Father of lights.
And we all have experienced the good things given to us from God. The rain is a good thing that God has given to us. The sun is a good thing. Our food and our shelter, all things provided by God. God provides.
Yeah. He does this for the good and the evil, like we saw earlier in Matthew 5. But in the context, he's responding to those who might think, when they're tempted to do evil, God is testing me. God is tempting me. Yeah. So he said, let no one say when he's tempted, I am tempted by God, because God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he himself tempt anyone. No. And then talks about how that happens, but that's why in response to that, he says, don't be deceived. Don't fall for that lie that God is the author of evil. No, every good and perfect gift is what he provides, and there's no exception to that.
That's you're right. There's no exception to that. Lord says, why is pain and suffering always placed on God? Why aren't people blaming Satan? I think a lot of people have been influenced by the Calvinistic view of this. They tend to think of God as being in absolute sovereign control of every single thing that happens. He micromanages the world, and therefore everything is laid at the feet of God. He is to blame for it all. And that's simply wrong. Again, I think that Calvinism has caused or brought about more atheists than anything else, even more than the Catholic Church. Now, the Catholic Church is certainly responsible for making a lot of atheists. Boy, that may make some Catholics mad, but nevertheless, it's true. But Calvinism, when you take the God of Calvinism, I can see why somebody says, that doesn't make sense.
Yeah. But I think this is a good point about Satan's involvement in this world, getting people to sin, and the consequences follow. Yeah. And we see in the book of Job that Satan did do those things to Job.
So, okay, let's explain the source and cause of evil. Where does it come from? And I'll just state it up front. Evil, pain, suffering, hardship, all bad things that happen in this world, they are caused by, and the source of those things is sin. Mankind and his environment became subject to hardship, sickness, and death because they listened to Satan and yielded to temptation and sinned. That is the root of everything that is bad in this world.
Yeah, physical death. It's a direct consequence of their sin. And like I said, all the other, like storms and earthquakes and all those kinds of things are all really indirect effects of the flood.
When God made everything, after he made whichever thing is stated that he made in Genesis chapter 1, when he got done with it, he said, it is good. And when he got done with everything, he said it is very good, including man. It's very good.
Well, actually, this is one thing I pointed out in a lesson a while back. He said it was good, whenever it said it, or it was so, throughout chapter 1. But then at the very end it says it was very good. But if you go to chapter 2, it says it is not good. That man should be alone. So
Right.
when he made the woman, then
It was
God
very, very
made
good.
it very good.
Yeah.
So all the
That's true.
creation was very good at that point.
Yeah. So, and Eden, the Garden of Eden was an incomparable paradise. On my cruise last week, James, we went to Nassau, Bahamas, and we were taken out to this island. I mean, they had dolphins and sea lions and all this stuff, but there were also, these beaches that just beautiful, just gorgeous. And many people think, well, this is paradise, No, that doesn't compare to what Adam and Eve experienced in the garden. Everything was perfect. There were no diseases, no pathogens, no genetic flaws, no viruses, no COVID. Nothing to make you sick, nothing to hurt you.
And the tree of life was there.
Yeah, that's exactly
So they had
right.
access to that.
And what's interesting about it is that, God made all these sources of food available to them. Everything was good. There was that one tree in the midst of the garden, the tree of knowledge of good and evil. That one tree was placed in the midst of the garden. Why? I've had people ask me, well, why did God do that? Because he created...
Gave them a choice.
He created Adam and Eve as free moral agents. If there were no options available to them, they would not truly be free. Okay? If there were no options, there would be no free will. There would be no free choice available to them.
But another thing about a relationship, it's based upon trust. Okay?
Trust and love.
Yeah, those two things, loving trust and a trusting love. But that's what God wanted to have, fellowship with Adam and Eve. And if they listened to him, listened to his word, everything would have been fine. They already had a knowledge of good. Take care of the garden, populate the earth. Here, you can eat of all the trees of the garden, just except for one. But Satan put it in their mind, oh, God only made this rule so that you won't eat of this fruit and your eyes will be open, you'll be like him to know good and evil. As if that would help them if they were to eat it.
Yeah.
If they make the wrong decision to do that, which when they already had a knowledge of good, why would they need a knowledge of evil? And so when they ate it, their eyes were open. They saw they were naked. They were ashamed. They were guilty. They were fearful. And so everything they thought they were going to get, happiness, no, it was the opposite.
Yep.
And it ruined everything, including not themselves and even their relationship with each other. You see now God blames her and blames God for making her. That's implied in there. And he cursed the ground as well because of it.
Yeah, why did, the woman that you gave me? And of course, Eve blamed Satan. Well, Eve's the one that made the choice, you see. But as long as they didn't violate God's law, everything would have been great. But they broke God's law. So we have law at the very beginning, by the way.
Yeah.
And what's interesting to me is Adam and Eve in this perfect sinless environment, okay, with one option to do wrong, multiple options to do what's right.
Yeah.
Everything was good around them. They were in the perfect environment, yet they chose to do wrong. And so I point out to Calvinists, there is no need, none whatsoever, no need for the doctrine of total depravity in order to justify the reason why men sin. Because if Adam and Eve could do that in a perfect environment, certainly in our fallen environment, sin all around us, we're going to be inclined to sin.
Yeah,
but it's not because we're born sinners.
No, and so James 1 does explain, we're drawn away by our own lusts and enticed. So the need for food, may cause us to sin, like Jesus was tempted.
Like Eve.
Just turn stone into bread. Well, all the trees were good for food and pleasant to look at. Mm-hmm. It says in Genesis chapter 2, I think in verse 9, which is interesting because, when you see chapter 3, verse 6, it mentions all three avenues of temptation, lust of the flesh, the lust of the eye, and the pride of life. It's the opening of the eyes that really set it apart from all the other trees. And that's what Satan appealed to, was pride. And the same thing happens a lot today. But God has provided the things that we need and a lawful way to obtain those things. Mm-hmm. But we choose a shortcut.
Those things unlawfully.
And an unlawful means of obtaining those things.
So, when Adam and Eve sinned, everything changed. Okay, everything changed. The environment changed. Mm-hmm. The world changed. Everything changed. Their surroundings changed. And now, let me emphasize this. Okay, ontologically. Okay, what change took place? Well, they became guilty, and their conscience was hurt by that. They knew that they were wrong. They began to die because they were removed from the tree of life. Okay, so you could say entropy began at that point. Everything began to run down. Their bodies, their cells began to deteriorate. That just like everything else around them began to deteriorate. Everything changed at that moment. And, that's why we have death. As God said, the day that you eat of it, you shall surely die. And thus kicked out of the garden, separated from the tree of life. Hey, okay, they're going to die.
Well, and they died that moment that
they died
ate.
Spiritually that moment.
Yeah.
Now, instead of dying physically that moment, something else had to die.
Yeah. The sacrifices.
What do you clothe them with?
Yeah, the animal skins.
So
the sacrifices of those animals had to.
That's right. Death came into being
them.
Because of sin, and every bad thing that happens because of sin. Mm-hmm. You go on down time a little bit, and you get to Genesis chapter 6, and James has already mentioned Genesis chapter 6. By this point, every thought and intent of their heart was evil continuously. But now we see God's judgment coming in and putting a stop to the evil. Okay, it had reached the point that God had to act. Noah was a righteous man. As God looked down from heaven, he saw all these other human beings evil in their thoughts and in their deeds, and violence was spread throughout the earth. So the flood occurred. This is God's judgment on sinful man. After the flood, you have something else changing. After the breaking of the firmament, no doubt there were climatic changes that took place.
Well, and there's changes in seasons. Because there'll be a continual change every year of seasons. So that is as a result of the firmament and all the water that was above coming down.
And the flood that took place, coming up, out, coming down, everywhere you had water coming in. Is that when the shift in the continents occurred? Possibly. There could be the changes that took place could be very drastic as a result of this worldwide flood. And no doubt there were major changes in the climate, because not long after the flood, you see men's lives beginning to get shorter and shorter and shorter. But okay, why does evil exist? Well, because of man's sin.
The question comes in, and you see it throughout the Bible. The prophets like Habakkuk, Lord, don't you see what's going on? Why do you allow evil to go on? How do you allow it to continue? The injustice in our court system and so on. The rich oppressing the poor. And God says, I'm going to send Babylon to put an end to it.
God brings an end to it eventually.
God has a sociological law, and that is that righteousness exalts a nation and sin is a reproach to any people. If a society gets so bad that God will send another nation to put an end to that suffering in that context. We see that pattern in the Bible over and over again, especially dealing with Israel and the nations around them.
Your comments are welcome. Of course, your questions are encouraged. You can give us a call at 1-855-568-1062, or you can comment in the chat section under the video on Facebook or YouTube, and we'll be able to see it, and we'll be glad to share it with those who are watching. And again, share, invite your friends to join us as well. So, okay, let's move on now. Let's make some observations regarding suffering and some more reasons why. Okay, the root is sin. Okay, the root is sin, and it began when Adam and Eve sinned, the very first sin. But now that's affected all of us. People suffer personally because of, many times, the decisions that they themselves make. Okay, like with Adam and Eve, their suffering was the result of their own choice. Okay, Adam and Eve suffered. When they were kicked out of the garden, everything changed for them. Things got hard, you know. Mm-hmm. They lost a son to their other son. One son becomes a murderer, the other son is dead. How do you think that made them feel? You know? You've got suffering from the very beginning because of sin. But many times, again, self-inflicted. David sins. In 2 Samuel chapter 12, verses 7 through 14, we see the consequences of his sin that we read about in chapter 11.
And then you see the consequences in chapter 13.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, and the rest of David's life, by the way. I mean, it continues to play out.
Yeah, really, the rest of 2 Samuel.
Yeah, the sword was put in his son's hands, you know, and they lived and died by the sword. You think about the grief of David just because of his sin. And by the way, right there in chapter 12, you know, in chapter 13, what happened? Yeah.
Well, that child died that was conceived by sin, by adultery. So sins of sex and violence, he sowed those sins and he reaped.
Yes, he did.
You know, and you always reap more than you sow.
Yeah. There are consequences to sin. We face those consequences. So suffering can be self-inflicted many times. We're all born with the ability to choose good or evil. You know, choose you this day whom you will serve, Joshua 24 and verse 15. Mm-hmm. We're the servants to whomsoever we yield ourselves servants to obey, Romans 6, 16 through 18. We make that choice. And when we choose evil, there are consequences for that choice. And that's one of the things, you know, today we live in a culture and a society which there are very few consequences. We're doing everything we can to get around the consequences of sin.
That's really been going on for 50 years at least, really longer than that.
Well, it's been going on for, men have always tried to find ways to get around the consequences of their sin.
But with social policy and technology,
yep.
You know, you see it happening more and more.
You know, yesterday, me and my wife were in Sam's, and I did all I could. I had to restrain myself. There was this little girl. She was probably 5, one 6, and we were going through the meat section, and she was sitting over behind one of those posts. And her mother kept telling her, you know, you need to come back over here and get back in the buggy. And she was yelling at her mother. I mean, saying terrible things about her mother, you know, I hate you and those kinds of things. And she was just screaming and pitching a fit. And she had sat down and she had crossed her legs and crossed her arms and wasn't going to budge. And this one, and we were just sitting there watching this, and the mother trying to reason with that child, to explain to that child why it would be a good idea to come get back in the buggy. Let me tell you something. If I'd have done that when I was a kid, there wouldn't have been a third time. Probably wouldn't have been a second time you come get in this buggy. First time, I didn't. She'd probably warn me one more time, and the third time, 3 strikes and you're out, buddy. She would have grabbed me up, and she would have put me in that buggy after she had beat my rear end. Good. That shows there are consequences for behavior. Children need to learn that from the very beginning. They need to understand there are consequences for bad behavior. Disobedience hurts, and they need to learn that. Mm-hmm. I remember reading a book. It was one of Dobson's books, and he gives the illustration of this young mother, little toddler. She's trying to get him to go to bed at night. She takes him, puts him in this baby bed, and of course he's in there pitching a fit, shaking crib and everything, and she just, oh, go to sleep, and she's trying to console him, and she tries to leave him alone for a little bit, but he's in there just screaming, and she goes in there, and several times she tries to reason with the little toddler, and of course the little baby's not having anything to do with it. She finally comes in after about a half an hour. She's losing the battle. Well, she lost the battle, every one of them, and now she's losing the war because she takes the little baby out of the crib and lets it go and do what it wants to do. Now, that's going to create a pattern of behavior from that point on. Mm-hmm. Listen, a few years later, she says, "Johnny, don't eat that candy. Don't get that off the coffee table. Don't." And little boy just looks at her, reaches down, picks a piece of candy up, and eats it. He knows nothing's going to happen.
Right. So,
we need to realize bad choices have consequences.
Yeah. And in Proverbs 29:17, this kind of reminds me of that verse where it says, "Correct your son, he will give you rest." One reason parents don't discipline their children is because they're too lazy. Now they're gonna have less rest when the child gets older. You need to give up that rest so that in the long run, you're going to have peace and rest when it comes to them listening. If things run a whole lot better.
Parents want to be friends of their children these days. They want to be their best buddy.
Yeah, that's another big mistake.
That's a huge mistake. Yeah. You need to be a parent, okay? You need to train that child. They need to learn early that you reap what you sow. For every action, there is a related consequence. Because, let me tell you something, the world's going to teach it to them eventually, and it's not going to be fun then. It's not going to be good.
Yeah.
And we do have a whole generation right now of young people who think that they are owed the world. They think that they deserve everything, and they're ungrateful. They think they can do whatever they want. That's why we have so many people who do not respect people in positions of authority today. Eventually there will be anarchy, and everything's going to crumble because of it.
Yeah, the example you gave, that was a person in a position of authority that was being disrespected.
Yep.
In a public way, and nothing was done about it.
It begins at home. If you don't teach them at home, it's going to go out then. When they're trying to play sports in Little League, I used to tell the kids that I coached, hey, they would be mad because the umpire called a pitch a strike when they thought it was a ball. And they'd come in mad, huffing, and they struck out, and they fling their bat. And I said, what did the umpire call it? A strike. Well, what was it? It's a ball. No. If the umpire called it a strike, what was it? It's a strike. Whether you agree with it or not, he's the one in authority. It was a strike. Listen, you take whatever the umpire, I don't care where the ball is. If he calls it a strike, it's a strike. You take your lumps. You go home with a smile on your face and get up next time and try again. If the umpire's making mistakes out there, that's my job. I'm going to go out and I'm going to do what I can to correct that. But that's not your place. You respect whatever he calls. If he calls you out on first base, That's it. Okay? We've got to learn how to respect those in positions of authority. So every sin, there is a negative consequence, some more evident than others. I mean, you have crime, you have immorality, you have drug use, alcohol abuse. You've got all these problems in our society today that's just making things worse and worse and worse. And I mean, everywhere you turn, you know, suffering is also often collateral.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you don't sin in a vacuum. Think about the result of Adam and Eve's sin. There were consequences, but not just for them.
Right. The ground was cursed. The ground didn't do anything wrong.
Nope. And guess what? We live in this cursed world too because of what they did.
Mm-hmm. We don't have access to the tree of life, so we die and babies die.
Yep. Death is here. Sickness is here. Pain and suffering, heartache, all the loss, all that is experienced because of what Adam and Eve did. And we all experience it because of what they did. Now, certainly we sin too. And so we suffer for our sins as well. Achan sinned in Joshua chapter 7. The children of Israel go up against this little bitty town, Ai. And they lose. And Joshua is stunned. You know,
And 36 people lost their lives too.
Yeah. Why?
36 Israelites.
Yeah. Why? Why did this happen? How could God let this happen? Well, there was sin in the camp. Achan had taken something from Jericho that they were commanded not to take.
Mm-hmm.
They were not allowed to take any of the spoils of the city, but he had taken the Babylonian garments, some silver, some gold. He went and hid it in his tent. Nobody else knew about it, apparently, except his family. Apparently, they were in on it, but nobody else knew about it. But yet it cost the children of Israel a victory. It cost 36 people their lives. Achan sinned. There's sin in the camp.
And
Jonah's rebellion,
It also brought shame upon Israel as far as in relation to the Canaanites.
Mm-hmm. You think about Herod, you know, when he heard that the king of Israel was born, well, what did he plan to do? He's going to stop it. He's going to kill the king. So the way that he's going to do that is kill all the male children 3 years and younger in Bethlehem.
Yeah, that's what Ashton preached about
Man.
when you were gone.
Just think about how terrible that was.
Yeah.
Think about the times that they lived. You know, we live in a very tame world today compared to what they lived in.
Yeah, a king could do anything he wanted, and this king was so selfish that he killed many children, and almost every family probably was affected in some way, even the grandparents of a lot of those babies.
So people who may not be guilty of, you know, that kind of sin, you know, they haven't hurt anybody, they haven't murdered anybody, they haven't plundered, stole, raped, pillaged, they haven't done those things, you know, but we've all sinned, right? But nevertheless, we think of people who aren't, you know, out, you know, running the streets, using drugs and shooting up grocery stores and robbing and, you know, okay, but even people who are trying to live a good moral life, you know what? They suffer too because of the wicked who choose greed and choose lust and choose hate and choose addictions and choose selfishness. You know, you suffer because of that.
Yeah.
People are killed on the highways every day because people are driving drunk or high under a controlled substance. Think how many reputations and lives have been ruined because of slander and gossip.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so it's a terrible thing. We all, I think, should understand that sin. Even though we're trying to live godly, moral lives, we're going to feel the effects of sin ourselves. Lori makes mention of something here. She says, my husband was hit as a pedestrian by a drunk driver going 70 miles an hour. He suffers to this day because of that man's evil decision. But my husband's responsibility is not to moan and complain about it, but to be faithful to God every day and cling to Him. We don't blame God because of that evil, but thank Him for the blessings that came from that circumstance. That's the attitude that we have to have. Absolutely. She also says the cause of evil more times than not comes from the heart and mind of men. Even the innocent will suffer because of the evil choices some men make. And that's our point, you know. So and that could be demonstrated in a myriad of ways.
And it's also important to remember we should not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. So even if we are innocent, you know, the way to overcome evil with good is to do good, to do what's right instead of seeking revenge, like Paul talked about at the end of Romans chapter 12.
Yeah, and ultimately, as we do good, we will be rewarded. I mean, our faith will be rewarded eternally.
And people who take revenge usually make things a lot worse for themselves.
Sure.
And there will be even worse consequences.
He who lives by the sword dies by the sword.
Yeah.
But think, children suffer because parents are addicted to gambling, to drugs, alcohol. I mean, that's one of the things. My wife used to work at the Civitan Center in Benton, and she had to deal every day with young children who come from broken homes and abusive homes, and it's heart-wrenching to see what goes on in our society today, and the suffering that children have to experience because of the sin, the wickedness of their parents. And think of divorce. Do we really understand? Have we thought about the damage that is done to children? Even if you say it's an amicable divorce, both husband and wife, and they're treating each other well, that's still damaging the child. There's no way around that. But most divorces aren't that peaceful. And the things leading up to that divorce aren't peaceful. And children see all of this. They experience this. They have to live through this. And they have to emotionally deal with these things. They suffer because of it. And that's why Malachi chapter 2, God hates divorce.
Yeah.
And one of the things that, infuriates me is people try to defend divorce. I was on a group where, there were, in fact, I preached a sermon a while back called, "Does God Still Hate Divorce?" And I was attacked by some professed Christians, but there's nothing wrong with divorce. It's how you handle it. There's nothing wrong. God doesn't hate divorce. Divorce is, if you can't live with somebody, it's better to get divorced and marry somebody. These are professed Christians who are making these arguments. God says He hates divorce, and He calls it a treacherous act. Yep. And that's what it is, because, and it does destroy the family. It does. That's what divorce is. It's family destructive in and of itself. And children have to experience that.
Well, it affects them more than anybody else.
It affects them more than the parents.
Every time.
But it affects everybody involved. And it doesn't just affect the mom and the dad that's getting divorced or the children. It affects, the other relatives of the family too. They have to deal with these things. It puts more pressure on the parents, grandparents. It puts more pressure on everybody. It makes everything hard.
Yep.
Parents suffer when their children choose the path of sin and rebellion. You think of a parent who, and many of us have experienced the sinful choices of our children, and it hurts. I mean, it hurts a lot. We do not sin in a vacuum. So certainly suffering is often collateral.
Yeah. People talk about victimless crimes. There is no such thing.
No, there is no such thing. And, okay, free will. when Cain's anger turned violent, God didn't stop him. Cain had free will.
He warned him,
Yes, he did.
and he warned him he needs to choose and not let sin rule over him.
The antediluvian world was filled with violence. God stopped it eventually.
Yeah.
But there was violence perpetrated against mankind over and over until it got to the point God just had to put a stop to it.
And that's true on a national scale, on in
That's when
societies as well.
We see that historically, God bringing judgment eventually upon nations because of they become so ungodly that God had to deal with it.
Including Jerusalem.
God will eventually right the scales of justice on the day of judgment.
Yeah, the final judgment. So taking a snapshot of any situation before the end is a mistake to say this is all that's going to happen or has happened. No, it'll be when Jesus returns. That's when judgment will take place. That's when everybody will give account for what they've done.
Answer to the sovereign God. Listen, God is not less sovereign because he has given man free will, because God is eventually going to hold every man accountable. Therefore, he is sovereign. But he has given us free will to make choices. Now, the result of free will is that men make bad choices. There are evil people, okay? We have terrorists. They plot, they murder, they destroy, they fly planes into buildings, they blow people up. Angry cowards shoot into innocent crowds. You know, they go into movie theaters and start shooting people up. They go into schools and shoot and kill and maim.
And others are targeting children because of sexual pleasure.
Sexual trafficking is getting out of control. Drug addicts. The drug problem in our country is unbelievable. You know, and think about all the problems that drugs are causing. And I'll throw alcohol in there. Alcohol is a drug.
Yeah, but they're causing a lot of deaths, and now fentanyl is being put into a lot of other drugs, and people are dying a lot from those.
Yeah,
even more so.
Rapists traumatizing their victims, and sex trafficking. All this greedy businessmen robbing and stealing. You know,
the violence, that divorce does, you kind of have that with, dirty business dealings as well.
Sure.
Financial violence is just horrible, as well as physical violence.
Now, okay, you're making that point. I want to tie something else and tie some of this stuff back. Where does this all come from? Okay, we say sin. That's right. God instituted the home to be a learning and training facility, institution, to make and bring about godly children. That's what Malachi, by the way, is talking about.
It says because he seeks godly offspring.
That's right.
So the home is God's institution. It's his school for relationships.
Mm-hmm. Now, when our families begin to deteriorate, and they've been deteriorating, and things are getting worse and worse and worse, I want to tell you right now, society is going to get worse and worse and worse. That's the pattern. It's always been that way. It always will be that way. The destruction of the home brings about the destruction of the society and the nation, and then eventually it collapses and falls upon itself. That's what sin does. We're out of time. In fact, we're over time, but I do want to go ahead and finish these points, if you don't mind. Christians in the New Testament suffered. And of all the people in the world who you would think should not be suffering, it should be those who are truly faithful to God. We've already pointed out examples of those who were faithful, yet they suffered. Job and Joseph come to mind. Elijah. You think about these people. I mean,
They suffered because they were doing what was right.
And in Hebrews chapter 11, you have a whole list of people who suffered because they did what was right, because of their faith. But listen, Jesus himself was executed on a cross. He lived a sinless life. His followers, he told them they would also suffer persecution. You got Matthew 5, you got John 16. And 2 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 12, yea, and all that will live godly in Christ Jesus shall suffer persecution. Why? Because the world, ungodliness, evil, wickedness hates the light and hates those who follow the light, who walk in the light. That's the way it's always been.
Yeah.
Go all about Cain and Abel, right?
Yeah. Yeah. It's the light of Abel's acceptable sacrifice that made Cain angry because it exposed the lawlessness of his sacrifice.
So what do we do, okay? How can we stay strong when the world around us is crumbling, falling all to pieces? We are suffering. We're hurting. Well, we need to realize, yes, our days are full of trouble. That's what Job said in Job 14, verse 1. Suffering is a consequence of man's sin. There's going to be suffering in this life. Romans chapter 5 and verse 12, Genesis 3:19. We need to understand that. Romans chapter 8, by the way, Paul is talking to suffering Christians in that entire context. And in verses 17 and 18, he talks about comparing, or how can we compare the suffering that we are experiencing with the eternal glory that's waiting on us. How can we really make that comparison? We can't, because we need to keep that eternal weight of glory in our minds. Hope needs to sustain us through the difficult times. But we need to realize we're simply sojourners and pilgrims. We need to see ourselves as pilgrims through a world that has fallen, broken, hardships, a world of trouble. And all of that, by the way, should help us to seek something better. We know there's something better than what's here. Mm-hmm. And people who have a life of ease are not near as apt to look for something better. They become content with what they have, in the sense that, and we all ought to be content with whatever we have, right? But they are so content that they don't look for anything outside of what they have materially. We need to see ourselves as pilgrims.
Yeah, they make the mistake of thinking that, physical ease and pleasure, it's spiritually satisfying, and it's not.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. So when bad things happen, we have three choices. We can either let it define us, we can become victims, and we can complain, and we can wallow in that pity and that sorrow. We can let it define us, or we can let it destroy us. We can give up and quit like what Job's wife tried to get him to do. Just curse God and die. We can allow our hardships to destroy us, or we can allow it to strengthen us. Now, faith is required for that third option to happen. We have to trust God. We have to seek out His Word. We have to live with faith and hope in our hearts to endure.
And also love God.
Sure.
I mean, we can't blame God.
Can't blame God. There's no need to blame God. It's not His fault. So hopefully we've gained some understanding as for the purpose of trials. James talks about this in James chapter 1. It brings about patience, and patience, hope. Character, and then hope. Romans chapter 5, by the way, makes that connection. Cast your eyes upon the Lord, your cares upon the Lord. He cares for us. So we need to take our troubles and put them in His hands and let Him. He's going to take care of it. It may not be today when we want Him to, but it's going to be taken care of. And just trust Him, because the day is coming in which we will enter into our eternal rest. And whatever care we have in the moment can't be compared to that eternal weight of glory that awaits us. We need to prepare for storms. We need to know to begin with that, yes, storms are going to come.
Yeah.
You know what?
For everybody.
When you're young, when you're a teenager, you think you're invincible. In your 20s and your 30s, you're strong. Everything's going good. You need to understand that a storm could strike at any moment. And you need to be prepared for that.
It's going to strike everybody. It hit the wise man's house and the foolish man's house.
Exactly.
It hits everybody.
We need to guard against anxiety and worry. And when things aren't going our way, we do need to consciously choose to trust God. Everything's going to work for good for those who love God and are called according to His purpose. That doesn't mean that you're going to have everything in this life work for a better life now.
Yeah, it's not saying that everything that will happen to you in this life is going to be good
Exactly.
either.
It's saying that all things work together for all the suffering, all the pain, and everything. What God has provided through His Son Jesus Christ is going to provide for you, that everything work out good in the end.
If you love God.
If you love God and are called according to His purpose.
Well, so if you don't, then it all works together for bad. It's the end result that's
Exactly.
good or bad, not the process.
Exactly. So enjoy the good times. Be thankful for what you do have. Be thankful. And enjoy life as you have good opportunities.
And even when things are difficult, there's still something to be thankful for.
Absolutely.
1 Thessalonians 5:18 says, "In everything, not for everything, but in everything give thanks."
There's a song. Chris Stapleton actually sings the song called "Daddy Doesn't Pray Anymore," and there's a line in the song that even when things were bad, Daddy gave thanks for all that he had. The food on the table, his wife and 3 children. Even when things were bad, what's he doing? He's praying. He's giving thanks. And that's exactly the attitude that we need to have. And so even in the good times, certainly we need to be thankful. But in the bad times, we need to focus our attention, because it's being diverted, or there's going to be some external pulls against, trying to dwell on the bad instead of focusing on the good. We need to consciously focus on the good that God has given to us in our lives.
That's what Satan wants to do. He wants to get us focused on the bad instead of the good.
God washes the eyes by tears until they can behold the invisible land where tears shall come no more. Yep. This world should help us to see more clearly the hope that we have. In 1 Peter chapter 5, therefore humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God, that he may exalt you in due time, casting all your care upon him, for he cares for you. Be sober, be vigilant, because your adversary the devil walks about like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. Resist him, steadfast in the faith, knowing that the same sufferings are experienced by your brotherhood in the world. But may the God of all grace, who called us to his eternal glory by Christ Jesus, after you have suffered a while, perfect, establish, strengthen, and settle you. Now, I don't know of a better passage to end the study than that one. We all experience hardship, suffering, pain. Where does it all come from? It doesn't come from God. It comes from the enemy. It's the result of sin. And as long as we live in this world, we're going to be touched by it. But there's something better. And we hope that everyone can divert their attention from the here and the now, the things that we can see, hear, smell, taste, and touch, and focus on the things that God has promised for those who love him and are called according to his purpose. And make that comparison. Not that we can make a comparison per se, not equivalent comparison. We can't put a number on it. But what we can do is we can just keep our minds focused on the eternal, that eternal weight of glory, and understand that, look, if my entire life was absolutely terrible from the time I was born to the time I die, and I lived to be 120 years old, guess what? That's just a dot in view of eternity. Keep that perspective. Thank you, everybody, for being with us. James, you got anything else to add?
Herb preached pretty much this kind of lesson last Sunday night, and I wish it recorded, because it was really good, especially coming from him and what he's been through, and it was very edifying. But yeah, when life hurts, and kind of dealt with all these issues and everything. And it's interesting. In Ashton, he had preached there, so we got some good men who can give some good lessons along this line, and we appreciate them. And that's all I want to do is just mention that we got folks here that would be encouraging you if you are struggling with any of these things, and we'd be happy to help in any way we can to encourage.
Absolutely. So, thank you everybody for being with us. Lord willing, we'll be back on Monday at 3:00. Also, if you're in Central Arkansas, we'd love to have you join us Sunday. We have Bible classes for all ages beginning at 9:00. Our worship begins at 10 on Sunday morning, and then again at 4 p.m. on Sunday afternoon. We also, of course, assemble on Wednesday evenings at 7 p.m. for Bible study. So anytime that you're in Central Arkansas, I'd love to have you. Thank you, everyone. Please like and share. Go ahead. This video is accessible. You can share it with your friends. They can watch it next week or next month. You know, it's on YouTube. It's on Facebook. Share, please, and invite them to join us live, and invite them to ask Bible questions, and we'll be glad to do what we can to turn to the Scripture and answer their questions. So again, thank you, everybody. Till Monday, may God bless. Hope that you have a great rest of the day, and we will see you then.